This is your brain on privilege. If privilege does not rot your brain, then explain Ben Shapiro, Katie Hopkins and Helen Zill to me. And before anyone gets pressed and shouts, correlation does not imply causation, at me, no, I'm not assuming a simple causal relationship between privilege and the absence of certain cognitive, emotional, or behavioral capabilities, because unlike Nicki Minaj I can actually do research. If at this point you are thinking to yourself, wow Cliff, this is a bit spicy, your assessment would be correct, because I have had it. Admittedly, my threshold for tolerating the antics of people in privileged positions is particularly low. Nevertheless, if the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it is that all the glass analogies for privilege, glass ceiling, glass cliff, glass escalator, glass slipper, are still very appropriate. Privilege is so invisible that even if you hold someone's face right up against it, making sure you apply just enough pressure to avoid going to prison, they still wouldn't see it. Therefore, allow me to offer some anecdotal evidence of the hypothesized privilege brain rot I'm referring to. Let's start with some meltdowns over something that really doesn't justify meltdowns. You are able to view a video of anti-mask mandate protesters on the original post. Grown men and women crying about kids having to wear masks in public spaces during a pandemic that has already claimed the lives of 674,000 Americans. Ignore the first clown though. He is U.S. Representative Madison Cawthorn, who is obviously just on his single-issue voter campaign trail. The rest though, yikes. Calling school mask mandates criminal, child abuse, and satanic, and straight up crying because my daughter is beautiful and I want you to be able to see her. To put this into perspective, at the time of writing this article, the United States account for only 4.28% of the global population, yet 19.18% of COVID cases and 14.81% of COVID deaths have been within the United States. Additionally, the pandemic's global mortality rate is 0.06%, while the COVID mortality rate in the United States is 0.21%, which is 3.5 times the global rate. Yet people are taking time out of their day to congregate and shout nonsense at each other, while others compare vaccination requirements to the Holocaust, and call COVID a hoax even as his lungs stop working, and the life leaves his body, all the while not a single black face in sight, but don't take my word for it, just listed to the smart people at the Financial Times. Their analysis reveals, or rather confirms, that the more conservative your politics, the more likely you are to be vaccine hesitant. Let's quickly look at what that means. According to the Pew Research Center, in the 2020 U.S. presidential elections, non-white people make up 40% of Democrat voters and fewer than 20% of Republican voters. In terms of the basis of privilege, that's 1-0 to the Republicans. Republican voters are also older, meaning more time to generate wealth and progress their careers, making that 2-0 for the Republicans. Compared to Democrat voters, Republicans are also represented by more men, specifically white, Christian men. So that's 4-0 to the Republicans, or whatever, these points are made up, but hopefully you get my point. Unfortunately, this is not an American problem. The same trends can be seen in my home country of South Africa. We account for only 0.78% of the global population, yet 1.89% of the global COVID-related deaths have been in South Africa. Additionally, while the global COVID mortality rate is 0.06%, the mortality rate in South Africa is 0.14%. Here I must admit, I am very much biased as I support peer-reviewed evidence-based healthcare, which of course includes vaccination. I have members of my own family turning their noses up at this safe, free, and potentially life-saving treatment for not only themselves but everyone they come in contact with. One of these individuals is even a healthcare provider themselves. I'm having a hard time reconciling my concern and my frustration. A recent poll revealed that Afrikaans people, my people, are significantly more hesitant to get vaccinated than other groups in South Africa. At the same time, I am also angered by the arrogance that seems to underpin most resistance to mask-wearing and vaccination I have seen. Illustrating this is a recent anti-vaccination protest in Cape Town, a video of which can be seen in the original post. Pause the video and watch white people my age who did not grow up during apartheid, calling a voluntary public health campaign medical apartheid. Can you even? As a psychologist, I should be more understanding and realize that these embarrassing public displays are likely nothing more than attempts to resolve intense cognitive dissonance. At the same time, though, I just can't with this behavior. I guess concerned, plus angry, equals spicy. Spicy as I might be, I am also thoroughly intrigued by the absurdity of this phenomenon. One would think that having privilege would translate into, let's call it an unfair advantage, to be able to act in your own best interests. Surely if the ship is sinking and you hear the crew calling women and children first, you would get into a lifeboat if you were indeed a woman or a child. I guess not. So, as promised, let's look at some research in psychology to try and make sense of this, shall we? More specifically, let's look at some models of cognition, emotion and behavior in the context of privilege. With regards to cognition, and without getting too stuck in theory, the most widely accepted model for studying intelligence, i.e. how good your cognition is related to our ability to remember, understand, solve problems, do math, write, and so on. Volumes upon volumes of scientific research have demonstrated that the assessment of these different cognitive abilities provides a suitable base from which to make predictions about future outcomes. Cognitive ability assessment is used to predict anything from academic achievement, job performance, and even the likelihood of future risks. Whatever the particular application, the assumption is that generally, high cognitive ability results in positive future outcomes. Let's test out this assumption with the three lovely individuals I mentioned earlier. Ben Shapiro is the holder of a bachelor's degree in political science and a law degree from Harvard, the author of 2 published books by the age of 20, and owner of a legal consulting firm. I do not have any psychometric test results of Ben to hand, but I think it would be a safe assumption to say that he isn't stupid. In fact, his impressive credentials are only surpassed by his awfulness. What is that you say? Being smart and being awful aren't mutually exclusive? Sure, but look at some of Ben Shapiro's tweets calling Colin Powell an affirmative action general and saying that Arabs live in open sewage. When I tell you I nearly fell off my chair. These tweets are still up. They are not fabricated, and he still has them on his Twitter feed. I literally took these screenshots now. What in Caucasian hell? I don't know who Colin Powell is, and as someone who has lived in the Middle East, I have not even the slightest idea why he is saying that Arab people live in open sewage. What I do know is that regardless of your politics, surely an intelligent person should know that it's just a bad idea to put something like that out there. Now sure, you can argue that it's a PR exercise to secure his Republican bag, but if you check the tape, you will see that man's talks a big game on Twitter and other written media platforms, but when it comes to defending his abhorrent opinions in real time, it just turns into one of those messy messes that you still cringe thinking about days later. It really is a tragic thing to behold, a man so self-assured, baiting people into flinging vitriol at him, expecting to be able to bamboozle them with one of his prized straw men, only to be shut down completely by a single critical thought. It should therefore come as no surprise that Ben also loves him some whining about mask mandates. So perhaps something is missing. Indeed, the literature on general intelligence suggests that having all the pieces of intelligence isn't enough to engage with others in a meaningful way. Critical thinking, the ability to reflect on new information relative to one's own beliefs and within a social context, is necessary if one is to avoid an endless cycle of public embarrassment and continuously alienating others. Now let's talk emotion. Also, let's give old Benny Bad Tweets a break and use another privileged individual to demonstrate the point. Sure, when we refer to the mind and its function, most people would understandably think cognition/intelligence. Emotion, however, is just as important of a psychological function as cognition. We all have emotional responses to our own thoughts and to external stimuli. One can regulate emotional responses, but for the most part, they are involuntary. Furthermore, our emotional state has a material impact on how we perceive the world around us. It therefore stands to reason that if we don't understand our own emotional responses, and that of others, we are heading for one of those messy messes I was talking about. Illustrating said mess is the social media post shown in the original post, which I did not screenshot myself as the originator had their socials justifiably suspended for being messy. The post shows Katie Hopkins with a target on her forehead with a caption that reads, "This is how it feels to be a white conservative woman." Someone reshared it with the comment, "I actually love this metaphor, because it is a fake target and you put it there yourself." That reply to the original post will forever go down as one of my all-time favorite clapbacks. This is not only a brilliantly funny response, but also highlights the problematic nature of Katie Hopkins' emotional response. The internet is a mess of complaints about cancel culture and white conservative Christians being under attack for the better part of a decade now. The post by Katie Hopkins, shown above, offers a clue as to why. My proposition is because people who have become too accustomed to their privileged circumstances experience any deviation from that privilege as a personal attack. Scholarly discourse on diversity, equity, and inclusion has been going on for a very, very long time. So while the professors I studied under, and their professors before them have been exploring concepts such as social identity, social dominance, intergroup conflict, and intersectionality for years, many people in privileged positions are now for the first time faced with the reality that the world does not revolve around them. Yes, public outcries about alleged persecution are infuriating, but when I see people like Katie Hopkins go on about how she is under attack, I kind of can't help but feel pity for her. Not to worry, that pity quickly evaporated after a quick Google search for Katie Hopkins COVID revealed that homegirl got by the Australian government after bragging on the gram that she was not following COVID hotel quarantine rules. Oh yes honey, the Australian Home Affairs Minister, Karen Andrews, made a public statement saying they acted quickly to make sure that the visa on which she entered was cancelled. Like I said, messy. The literature on white fragility and fragile masculinity offer an explanation as to why equality and accountability are often perceived as persecution by persons in positions of privilege. White fragility is based on the assumption that white people are socialized to view themselves as raceless, or as the default. The result of this worldview is that any form of confrontation with the idea that white people do have a racial identity and that this has consequences for themselves and others cause an acute emotional response, an emotional response which most white people are simply unable to process. Fragile masculinity is arguably significantly more complex. Compared to white fragility, fragile masculinity does not start from a base of neutrality, but rather a set of prescriptive social norms of what it means to be a real man. Research has shown that men are effectively trapped in a perpetual state of anxiety over losing their status as a real man, and the shame that accompanies this loss. This is a rather paradoxical position to be in. To date, men still enjoy a significant level of social privilege, yet this position is so precarious that it is experienced as being under constant threat. Resultantly, any confrontation with the idea that men might need to reevaluate their position in modern society is met with intense resistance. What the concepts of white fragility and fragile masculinity highlight is the importance of understanding one's emotions and being able to regulate them. Human beings are psychologically complex, and all of us experience emotional triggers. This in itself is not problematic. However, what seems to be the case in the context of this discussion is that people in positions of privilege are so insulated from diverging opinions, or any kind of critique for that matter, that the development of emotional awareness and the ability to regulate these emotions are stunted, ironically then resulting in stunts like the forehead target stunt pulled by Katie Hopkins. From stunt queen to court jester. Yes, I just called Helen Zill a clown. I've called her way worse on Twitter. As a young progressive white South African, I used to really look up to this woman. I thought, that's who I want to be when I grow up. Now, not so much. Before her career in politics, Zil worked in journalism and helped collect all manner of receipts on apartheid-era politicians. Her struggle credentials are impressive and admirable. However, what seems to be consistently omitted from the discourse around what Helen Zil has done in her pursuit of justice and equality, is the acknowledgement that she has done so from a position of privilege. Yes, she offered a safe haven at her home to political activists during South Africa's 1986 state of emergency, but when she spoke with her white mouth, people with all different colored ears listened. I'm not one to pit women against each other, but I do think Angelina Jolie sets a great example of how an awareness of one's position of privilege can have an incredibly positive impact. As shown in an example in the original post, Angelina Jolie used her influence to bring attention to her deaf co-star's struggles on the set of the new upcoming film, The Eternals. Jolie's actions not only made an impact on her co-star's life, but also facilitated the representation of a marginalized group. Acknowledging Zil's inherent position of power as an upper-middle-class white woman in South Africa does not detract from all the good she has done over the course of her career, but it does, however, contextualizes her more recent messy messes. Since court is in session, Helen's seemingly taking on the role of jester and all, if it please the court I present, Twitter. In the original post, samples of tweets by Helen Zil are shown where she makes statements about colonialism not being all bad. In this instance, I want to demonstrate how this narrative is not only appalling but also indicative of how privilege does a number on one's ability to function normally anywhere but an Aryan paradise. To do this, I will be gay marrying, of course, two psychological concepts. First, you have the concept of psychological priming. Priming occurs when your cognition is unconsciously shaped by the processing of previously encountered stimuli, and has most commonly been shown to produce unconscious racial and gender bias. Secondly, and more importantly, that of prosociality. Humans aren't the dominant species on the planet because we are the strongest, fastest, or the smartest, far from it. Our species has survived this long because of our ability to function as a collective. The argument here is that we are hardwired for prosocial behavior as an evolved adaptive function, which has been central to our survival as a species. Here, my argument is that within a social context of great privilege, a priming process over a prolonged period of time could occur to the extent that it shapes cognition that does not inform prosocial behavior. Let's take Helen Zil as an illustrative example. Many years of activism as a white person in South Africa has garnered her a lot of praise. This praise may have been well deserved, but experiencing years of positive reinforcement for speaking on race within a particular social context without adequate awareness of her position within this context appears to have primed her to believe that whenever she speaks on race, she cannot possibly be wrong. Connecting this inferred priming to prosociality, her cognition appears to have been so distorted by a priming process situated in privilege that she now engages in behavior which alienates her from the very people she once fought for. That said, I could not find anything of substance regarding Helen Zil and COVID messiness. That's something, right? If we consider the mind to be comprised of three separate, yet interconnected, functions, namely cognition, emotion and behavior, and we examine these functions among public figures in positions of privilege, a pattern appears to emerge. As I said at the beginning, I am not inferring a direct causal relationship between privilege and impaired psychological functioning. What I am saying, however, is that as part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion discourse, we should afford adequate attention to the possibility that the self-perpetuating nature of privilege could be, at least in part, due to how privilege deeply distorts the minds of the privileged.